We were laughing out. The last time John and I did this was at the Nashville Public Library, and there were 8 people there.
There were. That concluded us.
Yeah, including us, John's son, and Chrissy. So you have really moved along.
We've done well. We've done well, yeah. Your approval rating must be up.
No,
this is good.
I think it was the whole thing you said you'd give them a book if they came. So.
Oh, that was good.
All right, let me start with this. And by the way, if you hadn't had a chance to read the book, I know you're here because you're going to. This is an extraordinary book. I'm not just saying that because John's here. It is incredibly interesting and thought-provoking, no matter what your politics are. So this is I say this as somebody who lives in this world, this is a great and helpful book. So let me ask this.
Thank you.
What prompted this? I know you...
Charlottesville.
Okay, keep going.
Charlottesville. And I know you were dealing with some Confederate monument issues, too. So it was... I think August 12th was the date that the neo-Nazis and Klansmen march in Charlottesville, which was in support of a statue of Robert E. Lee staying on public property, led to the death of a young counter-protester. 2 Virginia state troopers died as part of the operation. And as you may recall, the incumbent president took him about 4 days to get around to saying that he was against the Klan. I'm not in politics, but that's what George Herbert Walker Bush used to call a gimme. You know, opposing the Klan is kind of a gimme. And he said there was blame on many sides. And he repeated that a couple of times. And I was at home on Sunday afternoon, and the editor of Time magazine, Nancy Gibbs, a great historian herself, called and said, "Do you have anything you want to say?" And I flopped around and decided, what were the moments that felt like this? Part of the problem of being me is, I think...
Innumerable.
I know, part. I said part, is I tend to think historically. So, you know, I'm very excited to hang out with. I can make John Tyler jokes, you know, which is a limited skill set. And Haslam tries to make John Sevier jokes. They're not as funny, let me tell you. And so... You know, America First is a phrase from the 1930s, Charles Lindbergh. The Reconstruction era is a wash in dark hours. And so what I wanted to do is figure out what it felt like in those moments. Did it feel like this? Because the question I get asked most often is, has it ever been like this? Even if you support the president, you are self-evidently worried about the direction of the country, or else you wouldn't have bet on someone who is so wildly unconventional. I mean, the incumbent president's argument was, this is so bad, I alone can fix it. So even if you're in the 45% or so that support the president, you are worried about the direction of the country. Then there's the 55% that tends to set its hair on fire every afternoon. The burn units of the nation are full of unhappy Democrats. So what I wanted to do was say, all right, if you had been in 1866, if you had been sitting around thinking about the direction of the nation, would you have been optimistic or pessimistic? And you would have been pessimistic. We had a president from East Tennessee who opposed the 14th and 15th Amendments, vetoed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, vetoed the Freedmen's Bureau Act, set up white supremacy for 90 years, 100 years, really. And so my thought was, and the piece I wrote was, we've been here before, we've gotten through it, but as always in journalism, everything gets cut, so the getting through it part was less in that piece. And it kicked around in my head for a couple of months. And in early October, really, I decided that because the moment, it feels so urgent, because it feels so dispiriting, I at least wanted to have my say.
So let's back up a little bit. One of the interesting things you talk about at the very first of the book is the whole nature of the presidency and the way the founders designed it. One of the things you talk about is that it's a fairly ill-defined role, yeah, mainly because they had George Washington in mind and they thought, well, George will figure this out, right, and we'll go from there. So talk to us a little bit about that. What is it? We live in a country that still has a president with a very ill-defined and changing role. What's been the impact of that?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, in Philadelphia in 1787, they spent far more time on proportional representation, on issues of the congressional branch than they did the presidency, partly because they didn't have bracelets that said WWGD, but they might as well have. They were looking at their first president. They said, he'll figure it out. So the presidency, from the very beginning, was a wager on character. It was an elastic office. It was open to definition. And as it's developed, it has become what a political scientist in the late 19th century called we've returned to the oldest form of government, the elective kingship, which is a little overstated, but not much. As President Kennedy said, the presidency has become the vital center of action. Woodrow Wilson wrote that the president has the capacity by law and custom to be as big a man as he can, and also as small. So it depends on the character of the person. You know this from your work. The Greeks wrote that character is destiny, and we've seen the character of the person who has risen to the pinnacle of the republic have a discernible effect on the life of the nation, whatever the Constitution might say. I would argue that one of our finest hours came in the 1930s and 1940s under Franklin Roosevelt, who led us through an extraordinarily difficult period of time, an existential crisis for democratic capitalism, ultimately a global war. And he did it in part because when he was 39 years old, on the 20th of August, 1921, he was the most promising young politician in the Democratic Party. He'd been nominated for vice president the year before. He had his entire future ahead of him. He went to bed at Campobello. He woke up and he couldn't walk. And he forced himself back into the arena. Winston Churchill wrote a piece about FDR in 1934, having met him only once briefly, saying that not one man in 1,000 could have ever left the house again. Not one man in 1,000,000 could have risen to the pinnacle of the unruly republic. And I'm totally convinced that one of the reasons FDR was able to do what he did is because he had forced himself to walk again. He wanted the country to do that. So character is destiny there. And whether the office is a force for good or a force for ill depends not entirely, but the beginning of that process, the beginning of that dialectic, if you will, is the character of the person.
And so let me stay there for a minute. So is the role of you talked about the frustration, regardless of where you are in the politics, that people feel, and I want to come back to that. But is the role of president just an impossible one today? The Atlantic had an article, you probably saw this week, saying we've outgrown the presidency the way we've defined it.
Yeah, the last time we had this argument was 1979. Lloyd Cutler, who was Jimmy Carter's White House counsel, great sage, wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post saying the presidency is now too big for one person. Ted Sorensen, I think, wrote a book about it. And then along came Ronald Reagan. And guess what? It wasn't too big. And so I don't believe that. Actually, John Dickerson, who wrote that piece, is a friend, and I wrote him saying, if you want to go on the road and debate this, it would be fun. We would go from nursing home to nursing home. Really exciting. Come for extra tapioca. So we'll let you know when that's on the schedule. So I don't think it's too big for any one person. It's ever since World War II, it's an unimaginably powerful office. You know how the nuclear codes work?
They haven't given them to me yet. We're not worried about Kentucky invading to that point.
Are you sure? Yeah, but you never know about Alabama.
Maybe.
Didn't you all feel last fall, we always say thank God for Alabama. Didn't you feel that way when that guy was running? I was so happy to be a Tennessean. We may screw things up, but at least not that way. So
for the record note, I was totally quiet during this part of the conversation.
This is a very generous and brave thing this man has done to sit out here and try to figure out whether or not he should laugh. So the nuclear codes work this way. Because of the doctrine of immediate response, we still have that because of the possibility that the Russians may launch everything at once. That's really a 6-7 minute window for a commander-in-chief to decide whether or not to launch our arsenal. That means that there's a little hotel key card that they bring to the president once a week. They change the codes once a week. And the president puts it in his pocket. And the fellow who carries the briefcase, you know, the football it's called, who's always with the president. What happens is what's in the football is the machine where you put the key card in and it launches our nuclear arsenal. There's no check or balance.
So
it doesn't go to...
So I didn't know, there's literally a card.
There's a card.
And what's the president do with it at night?
This one I have no idea. It's not even that hard anymore, you know? You sort of wish he made it a little more difficult. I'm gonna say this about that. I'm so tired of Donald Trump's private life. I just can't. I mean, I'm trying to explain to my children that Stormy Daniels is not a weather report. It's just incredible.
Well, let's go back to the book.
Sorry, yeah. He may be term limited, but he doesn't want to go that far. So imagine that. That's the power a president has. Now, if there's a tactical situation, if we were thinking about launching something at the peninsula in Korea or something like that, then there's a chain of command. But ultimately, when you vote for president, think about that key card, because that's going to be in that guy's pocket. I remember being fascinated by this because, if you think about it mathematically, George Herbert Walker Bush actually had that card, because the vice president also is the backup, for longer than any other human being in history, because it's vice president and is president. So it's immensely powerful. Human life is in his hands, all of human life. And so it's a big thing. And there is no check on that. My own view is that we will survive this. We may thrive in it. I mean, I don't know. I mean, intellectual honesty compels you to say, you know, if you argue as I do that if we had been sitting here in 1866, you all would be here because you were worried about Reconstruction, you were worried about whether or not the verdict of the Civil War would have its full implications. You'd be worried about moving from the agrarian society to an industrial society. You'd be worried about the trade routes with Britain, the Indies. As David McCullough likes to say, people in the past didn't walk around saying, "My, isn't the past an interesting place?" You know, for them, these were real questions. These were real contingencies. And it's a perilous time because, for all the analogies, Joe McCarthy being the central one, Joe McCarthy was never president. And that's a to be sure in this. But I believe there are 5 or 6 forces that shape the life of the country, just as a clinical matter, not a partisan point. I voted for Democrats and Republicans, plan to continue to. There's the presidency, there's the Congress, there are the courts, there's the press, and then there's all of us. And when 1 or 2 of those elements seems to be out of step with where we would like the country to be going, that just puts a larger burden on all of us. And it's a fundamental fact that from Plato through Aristotle, through Machiavelli in the Renaissance, to Madison in the 18th century, that a republic is only as good as the sum of its parts. Our dispositions of heart and mind are not simply individual matters. They have a broader ripple effect. And as Harry Truman said, and I think this is something we have to confront quite honestly, we have to face the fact that we get the government we deserve.
So you talked earlier about the frustration that people feel, and regardless of which side are they on. And I was at one of those dinners where you were looking around and think, okay, everybody except me here is somebody. I'm sitting next to Madeleine Albright, Clinton's Secretary of State, you know, obviously internationally brilliant and pretty astute politician herself. Yeah. And she asks the question of the room. In the room, this is February of 16. And by this point in time, it becomes obvious that Donald Trump is going to probably win the Republican primary. He's and 2 or 3 of his vanquished foes are in the room and a bunch of other folks. And she said, well,
that must have been cheerful.
It was an interesting dinner, okay? And she says, well, somebody explain to me what's happening here. And Newt Gingrich is there, and forget what you think about his politics, he's a pretty astute political observer. Or interesting, how about that? Interesting.
All right, if he didn't laugh, I didn't say anything.
And he basically says what you said before. He said, well, I think a whole lot of the country feels like I'm riding a horse that's not going to make it.
Yeah.
And this one's not going to make it, so I'm going to get off and get on some horse that I think is different.
Sure. I think three numbers, really, to explain why we're here with this position. One is 17%. That's the percentage of Americans who believe that the federal government can be trusted to do the right thing some or most of the time. That's down from 77% in 1965. So we've gone from more than 3 out of 4 Americans trusting Washington to fewer than 1 in 5. That's a key number. The second is 130,000. That's the number that the Commerce Department believes a family of 4 needs in household income to lead what we would think of as a classic post-World War II middle-class life, where every grown-up has a car, you take a vacation, which is a huge signifier of middle-class life. Household income in the country's ticked up a little bit, but it's about $57,500. So in that missing $70,000, with the distrust, you have the ingredients for the kind of populist insurgency that Trump represented. And I should have seen this. I was one of the many people who didn't think this would happen, including Donald Trump, by the way. There was no victory speech written. Do y'all know that? It was only a concession speech. May of 16, I went up to interview him for Time about how he was. We went to Trump Tower. It was about what books he had been reading. Let me know when you're ready. Did you get in much trouble in school? Let me know when you're ready. How he was thinking about the office. As it turned out, I should have kept my cab. But, so I go in. That's funny. I'll wait. Yeah. So I go in, and I'm early. And Trump Tower, there's a Starbucks on the mezzanine. So I go in, and I go up, and I get a cup of coffee, and I come back down. And absolutely true story. A family comes through the revolving door from the Midwest, clearly on the lower end of that economic equation I just laid out. It's a mother and a father and a little boy about 10 years old. And they're looking around, and the little boy says to his dad, "Do you think he uses that door that we just came through?" As if he were talking about Bruce Wayne or Tony Stark. I mean, Donald Trump had become a superhero in this little guy's mind. And clearly that had to come to some extent and some degree from his parents. And the dad gave a great dad answer. He said, "No, I bet he has a secret entrance." And the kid loved that, But here's the thing. Donald Trump didn't need to reach me, who was standing there thinking, I'm going to ask him about Chester Arthur and I'll be clever. He needed to reach those people because they were the ones that ultimately, in the right number of states, made this happen. And their cares and concerns cannot be dismissed. There were 10 presidential elections between 1980 and 2016. A Bush or a Clinton was on 80% of those tickets. 80%. 1987, 88 is when the household income wage numbers began to stagnate in historic terms. So there's a pervasive fear in the country, understandable and real, that the ladders to the middle class, the great promise of American life, are either rickety or non-existent. And it's a genuine concern. It drove the 1992 election. Remember, nobody explained globalization better than Bill Clinton. That synthetic intelligence, he understood it, he explained it. But President Trump is, to use the word apotheosis in the same sentence with Trump is tricky, but he is the culmination of a couple of forces. Economic anxiety, cultural anxiety, which are quite linked. To me, the most analogous moment to this is the 1920s, when there were 5 million members of the KKK. Indiana, Oregon, Colorado, Texas had statewide office holders who were members of the Klan. The governor of Georgia was a Klansman named Clifford Walker, who gave a speech saying we must build a wall of steel to keep the immigrants out so we can keep America safe for Americans. Any of this sound familiar? 50,000 Klansmen marched down Pennsylvania Avenue in 1925, unmasked. So that was a period. They were, we were moving from an agrarian to industrial society. There were jobs were increasingly vulnerable in the view of white working class Americans to immigrants coming in. The West Coast, it was terrible on the West Coast. I mean, the fear of the Chinese laborers coming in to the West Coast led to some of the most virulently racist rhetoric you can imagine. We signed the Chinese Exclusion Act. Theodore Roosevelt, whom I think most folks here would think of as a great president, right? He believed in a concept called race suicide that was quite prevalent in learned circles then, about if white people did not pick up their birth rate, they were going to be extinct. This was a totally respectable theory that he had picked up as an undergraduate at Harvard. So when you're pulling the matches out of your pocket, after you check your phones in a minute to see what he said most recently, before you strike it, remember that. And I'm not saying relax because we've been through it before. What I'm saying is let's figure out how we got out of it before and try to reapply those lessons.
So let me go back to, you talked about the idea that character matters, that character's destiny. And let's go back to, what are those characteristics of a president that you think are critical and important? I think if you ask most people who are on my political side of the aisle, they'd say, oh, I bet Meacham's one of those guys that's, he's a liberal East Coast elite. I bet I know how he votes. He was the...
Yeah, we're on the east side of West Nashville.
That's right.
Yeah.
But he was the editor of Newsweek when he was 11, I think, or something. So, but I mean, you talk in here very favorably, obviously, about FDR and Truman, and very positively about LBJ. But you also, I know of your personal affection and admiration for Bush 41 and for Reagan's vision, and my personal favorite, Calvin Coolidge, gets a few shout-outs in here.
He did very well, yeah.
TR and Lincoln, et cetera. So putting all this, let's put the political aside. What are those characteristics of a president that makes him or her one day be successful?
I think, and I'd love to throw that question back to you in a second, because I'd love to hear your view since you have been in the arena and had to deal with this. And it's not a partisan point. And it's also not, we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. None of the people the governor just mentioned, and none of the people I write about, is in any remote sense perfect. These are not movie characters. This is not Martin Sheen on the West Wing. It's not, they're not made for Rushmore. If they get to 51% of doing things right, they're way ahead of the game. And I don't know about you all. I don't want to drag you into my own assessment of myself. If I do things right 51% of the time, that's a hell of a good day. And I think that's true for the country. We can't, one of the reasons I use the word soul here, is I think there's a tendency in our popular imagination to think America is one thing, and if we approve of the way things are going, then we're being true to that idea, and if we disapprove of them, then we're not being true to that idea. And so this idea that we're about fair play and dignity and the right to rise and equality of opportunity, I think that lets us off the hook. Because I think there's, in the American soul, which translates as breath or life in Hebrew and Greek, and from Socrates through the Augustine and Aquinas, so both pagan and Christian thought, it is the essence, it's the center of who we are. It's not that the center of who we are is all good, and some president with whom we disagree has come in and hijacked that. Because we're the same people. We projected force around the world to fight tyranny. We're also the same people who, from 1865 to 1965, in our home state, lived with this functional apartheid. There's room in the American soul for both the Klan and Dr. King. And the question for a given era is which side wins out? Do our better angels win out, as Lincoln said, or do our worst instincts win out? And it's an eternal, perennial, daily struggle. And it's not just about elections, it's about all of us and all of our dispositions of heart and mind. So that's true for all of us, and it is particularly true for the presidents, because you don't get to that job without being immensely political, without being a little crazy. This isn't true at the statewide level, but you have to be you have to be more than a little nuts to think you can have that card in your pocket, right? That's some healthy self-regard. And I also wonder about a line of work where even if you're really popular as an American president, and let's see, the biggest majority winner, I guess, is Bush in '88, maybe Obama. Bush or Obama at 53, 52, 53, 54%.
Right.
All right, imagine that, though. That means that in this room, if that president sat down, 47% of you would want him fired. So psychologically, that has to have some impact. And that's one of the reasons presidents will tell you all the time, oh, well, I don't read the papers. But they seem to always know who to be mad at. So how does that happen, My favorite example of that is, I won't mention any names, but I don't read the papers, but man, I hate the New York Times. Gee, who could that be? So I think it's the characteristics that have marked great presidential eras have been chiefly presidents who I think have in mind, because it's not all altruism, what I think of as the oil portrait test, which is what are we going to think when we look at their oil portrait? Because the portrait lasts a lot longer than any particular cycle, any particular election. And the greatest example of this, I think, in doing this, my regard for Woodrow Wilson plummeted, and my regard for Lyndon Johnson rose. And I stopped in 1965. There's a little bit about Reagan and 41 and Obama, but not much. Lyndon Johnson was a white senator from a segregated state who was not a champion of civil rights when he was majority leader of the United States Senate. The fact of his national election as vice president began to change his view. He did have a sense, as did Harry Truman, who underwent a similar drama, that by being elevated to the central position, you had to govern for everyone. And I think if I could pick one thing to say about what makes a president worth commemorating and worth emulating, it would be the sense that they had to govern in the best interests, not of those who support them, but the best interests of the whole. And not everyone does that. Truman was from Missouri, which we think of as a border state, but pretty racist. He had ancestors who had hated Lincoln, loved Lee.
And he almost joined the Klan at one point.
Almost joined the Klan. He found out it was anti-Catholic and had Catholic friends, and that did it. But Hugo Black was a member of the Klan. Robert Byrd was a member of the Klan in that era. April 12th, 1945, Truman becomes president. FDR dies at Warm Springs. Mrs. Roosevelt's at the Soulgrave Club in Washington. She gets a call. She goes to the White House. They tell her the president's died. They find Truman, who's drinking whiskey with Sam Rayburn in a basement room in the Capitol. Not a bad way to find out you become president. I don't know when you find out you become governor, but and I'm sure it'd be Jack Daniels. So, or Dickel, he has to be local. He goes to the White House. Mrs. Roosevelt, who's sort of a hero in this book, actually. I had not fully engaged with her in a long time, and really, she's an extraordinary figure. Wonderful, wonderful American and global figure. She says, Truman says, is there anything I can do for you? And Mrs. Roosevelt says, no, Mr. President, the question now is there anything we can do for you? For you are the one in trouble now. And imagine becoming President of the United States in April of 1945. The armies, the most powerful armies in the world are converging on Berlin. You think the Pacific War is anticipated to go on another 2 years. You had to mount an invasion, presumably of the home islands of Japan. Casualty estimates ranged as high as 1 million for that. There were people like George Bush, there were people like Gerald Ford, there were people like my grandfather who were fully expecting to be in that wave of the invasion of Japan. Truman knew a little bit about, because he had been as vice president, a tiny bit. He knew that we'd been spending a lot of money on a big weapons program, but didn't fully understand what it was. And by the way, no one did, really. No one truly understood what the atomic bomb could do. They didn't even know if the damn thing would go off. Bill Leahy, who was the White House Chief of Staff, Navy Admiral, said, "This will never explode, and I speak as an expert in explosives." So as usual, military advice was right on target. So you get this enormous thing. And Truman rises to the occasion. It's one of the great stories. Rises to the occasion. He begins to hear at the end of the war increasing numbers of reports about lynchings and violence against African-American GIs who were coming home. And it drove him crazy. His view was you could not send people abroad to fight for liberty and then not offer that liberty at home. Americans we're the most brilliantly and charmingly hypocritical people on earth. But that was one bridge too far. There was a fellow in Orangeburg, I think, South Carolina, who was blinded by a billy club, a policeman wielding a nightstick, pulled off a bus just after he'd filed his discharge papers. And Truman said, "My God, I had no idea it was as bad as that." So he commissions the first presidential report on civil rights. He becomes the first president to address the NAACP at the Lincoln Memorial and integrates the military. The speech to the NAACP in the Truman Library on the fourth draft, that is the typewritten draft, and there's a line like, "And I assert that these rights are essential." In Truman's wonderful handwriting, it's a spiky, fun handwriting, he's written, "It's essential," he writes, "for all Americans, period." And then he wrote, "And when I say all Americans, I mean all Americans." And you can see the power of the ink on the page. He wrote it with such force. Johnson, the same thing happened with Johnson. The night President Kennedy was killed, puts on his pajamas, goes to bed in Washington, invites all his aides in, which at least it wasn't in the bathroom, which Lyndon also did. Do you do that? No. Just want to make sure. You certainly can't. When you're out of office, no one's going to go in there. So if you're going to do it, I'd hurry. He's giving all these orders, funeral plans, which foreign leaders to call, and says, "And on the Civil Rights Bill, we're going to pass it, and we're not going to change a comma." And they were like, the '64 election was no one knew it was going to be the biggest landslide in history. The reason Kennedy and Johnson had been in Texas in November of 1963 was because there was a split in the Texas Democratic Party between John Conley conservatives and Ralph Yarborough liberals, and there was a bright young Republican who'd spent some time in Midland and had moved to Houston to be in the offshore business, who was going to be the Republican nominee. And John Tower had just become the first Republican senator from Texas since Reconstruction, winning the special election for Lyndon Johnson's seat. The young guy in Houston was George H.W. Bush. And the idea for Lyndon Johnson that they could lose Texas in the '64 election, the Kennedy-Johnson ticket, or the idea that there could be two Republican senators from his state, he couldn't abide it. So that's why they were there to begin with. There was every political reason to punt on civil rights in 1964. But Johnson said, when they raised this, he said, "Well, what the hell's the presidency for if not to do the big things that other men might not?" And maybe that sounds sentimental out of context, but think about Lyndon Johnson, the most political man who ever drew breath. He used to when he was president, he would call Texas and follow local school board elections just to relax. But there was something about having become president that he wanted to finish the work of Lincoln. And that was beyond his base. That was governing for everybody, not just for the white Democrats in his party.
Two more big things I want to talk about, and then we're going to open up to the crowd. The first one is this. You give a lot of great examples of that, like you just talked about with LBJ, of courage in a certain situation. And what's the old joke? That there's a reason Profiles in Courage is such a thin book.
That's right. That's right.
But you give a lot of great examples, but you also give a lot of examples of people making practical decisions, if you will, of that their principles didn't come out so strong, that it's FDR and not supporting the anti-lynching bill, FDR and not welcoming the refugees from Nazis. There's a lot of examples of Lincoln.
Internment.
The internment, you have Lincoln, who, with all the things he did, he made some very, very practical decisions along the line. So, you know, I can say that for us, that sometimes it looks like, well, here's the great and noble thing to do, but I'm not certain that's going to really get us where we could be. And so you make a decision that in the short term, people go, well, why did you do that? Help us understand when...
You mean it's short-term convenient,
well,
long-term, you wish you could do something else?
No, actually the opposite. Sometimes it's like the principled stand looks like it's here, but that's going to be that's not going to work. Right. And you're going to end up having, I mean, think about, again, there's numerous cases with Lincoln that you cite in the book where he makes a much more practical than a principled decision.
Sure.
And so what have you seen throughout?
Well, it's a question of, I think it's where is your heart? That is, and what is your end? Lincoln, to use a technical term, trashed the Constitution in order to save it. Right. He suspended habeas. If Donald Trump tweeted that he was going to do what Abraham Lincoln did, everyone here would collapse. But he did it consciously because of a central Machiavellian insight that the ends justified the means. This has started with Thomas Jefferson, who was against executive power until he had it, which tends to happen, I suspect. Quick story about that. First of all, if anyone has rap lyrics to Jefferson, I'll be here afterward, because we could use that.
I did notice you took a shot at Hamilton in the book, that he was the one that wanted Washington to be president for life.
How is it a shot if it's true? What does that mean? And by the way, I'm not the only guy to take a shot at Hamilton, because it didn't work out for him.
In the long-running Hamilton versus Jefferson battle, Mr. Meacham is firmly on the side of Jefferson, or as he says, my guy didn't die in a gunshot in New Jersey.
In New Jersey, that's right. That's right. And I made that joke once to Chris Christie. The damnedest thing happened. I couldn't get back into the city. So Jefferson was confronted with buying Louisiana, right? Doubling the size of the country, a vast step toward becoming a continental nation. But he had been against a liberal, a loose construction of the Constitution back when Washington, Adams, and Hamilton were doing it. Now that he was in charge, he thought, well, there's a lot of virtue in that. And he wrote a couple of very insightful letters about the justification of such a decision that Jackson drew on later, that Lincoln drew on, that FDR drew on. And they boiled down to, in questions of national survival, you do things that might be beyond the letter of the law in order to preserve a sphere in which the law will prevail, which sounds perhaps like the most brilliant rationalization you can find. But part of my point here is that we live in a fallen world. These are sinful guys. They're driven by appetite and ambition and shortcoming. They have good days and bad days. They're pretty lousy husbands some days. They're not particularly good fathers. They compromise. They cut corners. But the ones we remember and the ones we can learn from are the ones who, when it really counted, did the right thing. And I think that can be said for the country as well as the presidency, because, and please react to this, office holders, it seems to me, with very few exceptions, and the very few exceptions are what we write about and talk about, are more often mirrors of who we are than they are molders. Do you agree with that?
I do, because it's, and if you ask me, while I have this, I share with you this optimism, we've gotten over hard problems in the past, we'll do that again, but I do worry even more where it's so instantaneous. You know what the people are thinking right away. I mean, we have a state rep here, and he can tell you, we have members that sit on the floor and, oops, I'm going to change my mind because I got 10 emails while I'm sitting here in the middle of the debate. And so I worry a little bit that we're even more susceptible to that than we were before.
That's fascinating. I'm not a denier of that. but I'm a skeptic of it. If only because if you hadn't gotten newspapers and suddenly you had 2 or 3 newspapers coming in every week, every month, suddenly that was a totally rapid means of communication. Before the radio, after the radio, suddenly you had, I think, parenthetically, I think the radio is one of the most fascinating things because the rise of the Klan that I described earlier in the 20s also tracks the rise of the radio. And I have a theory that part of this is the beginning of the same kind of culture wars we see now, where families began to have their kids and themselves have their culture shaped by these distant people, these programmers. So if you had been on a farm, like most Americans were, for a century, you shaped your culture. You, your church, your neighbors, that was your world. Suddenly you had a box in your house, which is like the phone in the pocket, where these distant people in New York or Hollywood are coming into your life in an incredibly immediate way. And that has wonderful benefits, but it also made people wary. And then, of course, the rise of television.
Yeah, I'd only push back a little that back in '78, I was working for Howard Baker in Washington doing the incredibly important job of opening mail and responding to constituents.
You did well, sir.
That's right. But
I'm sorry you didn't have much of a future after that.
At the time, the controversy that it ends up costing Baker, arguably the Republican nomination in '80 against Reagan, was should we give away the Panama Canal? And most of us today can't remember, like, do we own it now or not? We don't. Yeah. It's kind of one of those. It was such a big deal, but we got in thousands and thousands and thousands of letters that I, replied to and put his automatic signature on and sent back. But in a way, that didn't feel as present now as what it does with the immediate feedback. In a legislative office, by its very nature, is reactionary in nature. I think the executive office is made to be where that person's supposed to lead.
Right.
And the legislature, by its nature, reacts more. I just think it's exacerbated the reactionary tendency of any legislative body.
Well, you would know. That's fascinating. Do you think that, is there an upside to that at all?
Well, I think it's harder to step back from the battle and see, is that a momentary thing or is that...
Well, you wonder if it gets normalized.
Right.
That is, my view of the technology stuff is just because we have the means to express an opinion quickly doesn't mean we have an opinion worth expressing quickly. Let me tell one Jackson story.
Yeah.
So when I was with Trump that May, when he was running, Andrew Jackson never came up in the conversation. But then the man I now refer to as the late Steve Bannon, he gave him the Jackson analogy. And because the portrait went up in the Oval Office, and remember the president came down in March of '17 to lay that wreath at the Hermitage. And I was sitting at home and I was thinking, well, I should do something. So I wrote an open letter to the president. It said, if you're going to be Jackson, don't just embrace the crazy parts, which is easy to do because there are a lot of them. Jackson once said his only 2 regrets in public life were that he had not hung Henry Clay, his vice president, and shot, John C. Calhoun, his vice president, and shot Henry Clay, the Speaker of the House. We now know that no one felt that way about their running mate until John McCain. But... So I wrote this piece saying, Jackson believed in the Union, one great family, all that. It had no effect whatever, of course. The Tennessean very generously ran it. It was the whole front page of the paper. And true story, the next day I was walking into lunch and my phone rang and it was George H.W. Bush. And he'd been in the hospital a lot, so his staff had given him this piece to read. And he said, how you doing? The key to doing George H.W. Bush's voice, as Dana Carvey once said, is Mr. Rogers trying to be John Wayne. So I said, I'm fine, Mr. President, how are you? He said, I'm fine. He said, I read your letter to Jackson. I thought, oh, the old boy's losing it, right? He thinks I'm writing letters to dead people. This is totally true story. I said, thank you, Mr. President. You know, actually, it was a letter to Trump about Jackson. He didn't miss a beat. He said, yeah, but Jackson will pay more attention. All
right, last question, and this is one
That's right on point.
The conversation actually is because one of the things, and I'm trying to find a couple passages, but you talk about a lot is the issue of populism. And you talk about it at some point, I guess it's Truman says the two most dangerous people in the world are Huey Long, populist on
FDR,
FDR. Huey Long, a populist on the left, Douglas MacArthur, populist on the right. You use a sentence in here one time where you say, let's see if I can find it, institutions that are put in place to check popular opinion. And you talk about, maybe with McCarthy, said the only problem with it was democracy, that he was still, at one point in time, wildly popular. So help us think through that. You know, what are we saying as a country? You got, okay, the majority of people are saying this. This is where popular opinion is. And then what is people who believe firmly in the democratic process, what are we to do with that where the popular opinion needs to have checks on it at times?
Well, it simply will. You know, you can't be for the Constitution when it checks what you don't want to have happen and then be against it when it checks what you do. This doesn't work that way. The covenant of reality, the American covenant, is it's going to check radical reform in any direction. That's what they designed it to do. You ask about the presidency being obsolete. People have, since the 1930s, have wondered whether an 18th century document based on Newtonian principles, which is balance and order, could survive in a world that was essentially Darwinian. It's about struggle, but we believe in that here, right? We're okay, yeah. It's tricky. You didn't say it, that's good. That's good. That's why you're where you are. So is that document relevant? Is it resonant? Is it durable enough in an era of global governance or where legislators are looking at their phone? You know, they could never have imagined this world. I don't want to make a fetish out of the wisdom of the founders, but my God, we're working on 240 years.
Really true.
I mean, the reason is, and I have kind of a theological view of this, is it's a document that understands human frailty. It's not a clinical document. It totally takes cognizance of appetite and ambition. And it assumed the worst of us, rightly. So it decided, you know, and there are many Republican, lowercase r, elements in it that check Democratic, lowercase d, impulses. The Electoral College, the presidential veto being able to be overridden, any number of things that, as Madison said in Federalist 51, was to make ambition counteract ambition. And that's why, ultimately, I'm optimistic about the future, because I believe this document is resilient enough, and I believe enough of us understand that and will fight for it, that any attempts to subvert it in a fundamental way will be met with resistance. And there are moments, I was in Houston last night, and somebody asked me, why are special interests such a problem now? And I said, well, you know, in Philadelphia in 1787, the slaveholding states, they weren't called the NRA or the AARP, but that was a special interest. The New England shipping world that wanted to keep the slave trade, so they were willing to compromise on the pushing the date out, that was a special interest. Totally parenthetically, you know, Oliver North just became the head of the NRA. This is the best news for gun control advocates you could possibly imagine. Ask him how the Iran deal worked. It's going to be good. So we've always had to take note of the conflict of interest in the arena. And the point of the system is not for all of us to agree all the time. That won't happen. Jefferson said that disagreements of opinion have shaped free society since Greece and Rome. What I do think we have to work on is this tendency to tribalism. If you watch Fox, you think that everything they say is right. If you watch MSNBC, you think everything they say is right. And rarely the twain meet. And that's a real problem, because 99 times out of 100, I may disagree with you, but I bet on the 100th you might have a point. And we've got to get to a place where that 100th conversation can take place. And I think the broad media has exacerbated that. We now have an entire industry, and I'm part of it, so I acknowledge this, that's devoted more to the perpetuation of conflict than the resolution of problems.
True.
Cable news and
if I could underline anything you said, it would be that. We have to always remember there are people who have a big stake in keeping things contentious. And you have to remember that.
Yeah.
And I like Howard Baker, who I referred to earlier, he had a saying I love. It says, always remember the other fellow might be right.
Yeah.
But if you listen to Fox or MSNBC or whatever, you think, well, no, the other fellow's never right.
And this is a genuine problem. And there is a precedent, and we have survived it. So there's hope here. If you dehumanize the person you're disagreeing with,
right,
you're not being true to the system that has produced a country that we all believe is worth defending and protecting. If you've come in here on this pretty day to listen to us, you clearly want, you're really dorky. We have a 12-step program, we're in it. You have to admit you have a problem first, okay? It took Haslam a while, but Chrissy did the intervention. It was great, actually, it was great.
The great thing about interviewing Meacham is you don't have to say anything.
I live in a house with 3 women. I never get to talk. So this is very exciting. Oh, come on. Was I saying something? I don't know.
All right, it's my turn. I'm supposed to make certain we leave some time for questions from the audience. So, Reverend Clay Stover.
Reverend.
Thank you, Governor John, for a great dialogue. Was the 2016 election not, to a degree, blowing up of the two-party system? That's the first part of my question. The second part is, John, do you want to make any predictions about the future and the role character will play in future candidates, and also just what the future looks like for Trump? Will he make it through a first term? Will he run again?
Yeah.
Two-part.
I'll try to answer it. Did y'all hear that? No. They were easy questions. Yes, no, maybe.
I'm glad Clay's my friend and he addressed them to you.
So the first question is, was the 2016 election a blow-up of the two-party system? No, in this sense. Because of the Electoral College, we will always have 2 parties. To have 3 on the national level prevents somebody from getting to 270 votes. So that means that any presidential election would go to the House of Representatives. It's the reason, France has more parties than they have people. And people have said, oh, we have this vibrant, complex democracy. Why do we only have 2 parties? It's because of the Electoral College. So the reason Michael Bloomberg has never actually run is because he thinks he could win a plurality, but not win a majority Electoral College. And under the Constitution, that sends it to the House, and so whatever majority of the House at that time would elect their candidate. So what I do think it has done is, I think we're in the political equivalent right now of climate change, where one day it's 90 degrees and then it's 30. It's just a chaotic period. A lot of people who voted for Barack Obama voted for Donald Trump. That's kind of hard to work out.
But it's actually important to remember to figure out where we are now.
And how quickly things change. Right? The other thing we don't do enough is give the country credit for having had our first African-American president, elected twice, who governed, even if you disagree with him, governed with great dignity and grace. And, the best thing that arguably ever happened to George W. Bush and Barack Obama was Donald Trump winning, because they look like Cicero and Aristotle now. In the land of the blind, you know, those with cataracts can see. So I do think that the parties, they don't make a great deal of sense right now. The last significant change was the mid-1960s because of the racial issue. You know, every white Southerner was a Democrat, basically, from Reconstruction until the mid-60s. I think that one of the generational things to keep an eye on is, Brad would know more about this than I would. I think the folks coming up, as they say, I think there's a millennial inclination to libertarianism. In all kinds of things, in matters of faith too, right? You know this. You know, in theological studies, the most interesting sociological thing going on is what's called the rise of the nuns. And we're not talking about the Sound of Music nuns. It's the affiliated with nun, N-O-N-E, or people who are spiritual, not religious. So I think that whichever party gets to a place where they are more libertarian may have a very viable future. Do I think Trump will finish? I didn't think he'd start, so what the hell do I know? I just don't know. Whenever the tweets start coming fast, I think he must have gotten a letter from Mueller. But it's what Donald Rumsfeld would call a known unknown. I will say this, that's worth remembering. Watergate, June 17th, 1972, was the Watergate break-in. Nixon left office on August 9th, 1974. It was 26 months. These things take time. And if there's something there, I think Director Mueller will find it. There's a prima facie obstruction case because he's already told Lester Holt what he did. You know, people say, Rudy Giuliani, who apparently cannot shut up. Do not hire this guy. I mean, he really has managed to actually make things worse for his client, which is hard to do in this case. He said, we don't know if we're going to answer the subpoena. Well, I don't think Lester had subpoena power. And Trump said, I fired him because he wouldn't stop the Russia investigation. That's it, right?
Yeah, I'm going to go way back here. Yes, sir.
Jim Comey has argued that the best way to end the current situation is for Donald Trump to be defeated. And that would bring the citizens of the country to make a statement. Now, there's another alternative, and that might be if the House and the Senate flip the elections that are coming up in 2018. And that might be lead to impeachment. Can you comment on those two alternatives, the pros and the cons, which might be the best? Now, I won't ask you to comment on the third alternative, re-election.
Yeah. I think if you're anti-Trump, to put your eggs in the impeachment basket is probably not a great bet. So I think it'd be, and again, I don't know what his impeachable offense is at this point. As Gerald Ford said, an impeachable, a high crime and misdemeanor is whatever a majority of the House and Senate determine it is at any given time. So maybe there's something there. I think that he will, I do think, Clay asked this too, I do think he will run again. I think he is running. I don't think he can stop, honestly. He's become the entertainer-in-chief as much as the commander-in-chief. And I think that says as much about our culture as it does about him. I think he's president not least because he mastered the vernacular of reality TV. He knows how to build an audience, hold an audience, build suspense. He's brilliant at saying, you always know he doesn't got anything to say when he says, I'll have more on that later. There's like tax returns, we're still waiting. So the impeachment thing I don't see as, at this point, knowing what we know, I don't see what is impeachable. But yes, I mean, this is a stress test for citizenship if you oppose this guy. But remember, only 55% of the country opposes it. I suspect most of that 45% may be here. So 55%. We are in this, again, tribal moment. where if you're for the president, you think that questions like that are incredibly premature or even crazy. And so I think that the means of politics offer us the best chance. So yes, finding a Democratic nominee who can win in the right number of states. I think it is important, and I'm not saying anything about his legitimacy of his election at all, but it is important to remember that Secretary Clinton won the popular vote. And so, but she may have been, do you agree with this, the only Democrat in the world who could have lost to this guy for various reasons. So.
Great. Sam will go, yes, ma'am.
So speaking to, I really appreciated the information you gave about the card, because that, for me, just raises even more concerns about the fact that the man who's holding the highest office in the land has so little self-control. He seemingly lacks respect for the office itself, as for the people who helped him get there. So, I guess, I mean, I want to be helpful for our country too, but it boggles my mind every time a tweet is issued that there are still people like Paul Ryan, who's now not running again, like Bob Corker, who's now not running again, who seem to me are more concerned with just protecting their base versus stepping up and saying, listen, this man isn't qualified to be where he is. And I understand your point about impeachment, that the fact that may never come, but it frightens me seeing how since he exhibits lack of self-control on a daily, hourly basis.
Right.
What kind of danger we're in if nobody can really pull that card out of his pocket?
Yeah. Senator Corker did what I think of as one of the great acts of trolling in American history. Because what he did recently, you may remember, is he had a set of hearings about the nuclear chain of command. Gee, I wonder why he just chose this moment to have that. I thought it was kind of brilliant, actually. I mentioned this to him. I don't think he knew what trolling meant. I think he thought it was a Game of Thrones thing. But anyway, we had the kids on the staff explain it to him. I think that the thing I would say, and maybe this is not entirely therapeutic for you, but I believe it, is there's a fabled moment about the congressional opposition to Richard Nixon. People talk about the Barry Goldwater moment. You'll hear more and more about this on TV. Barry Goldwater and Hugh Scott of Pennsylvania and John Rhodes of Ohio go down to the White House and tell Nixon he doesn't have the support to continue, and Nixon therefore resigned. It's sort of this anti-Paul Ryan, if only we had Barry Goldwater again. Okay, do you know when that was? What date? August 7th, 1974, in the afternoon. It was 26 months after the break-in. So I share with you some, because I think about what would I do if I were, faced these issues. The elected officials are caught, you can fact check me on this, caught between, if you're a senator from Tennessee, you're in a state, he carried what, 63?
And within your primary is still at 75% favorability.
Okay, so your voters aren't worried. They didn't want Hillary Clinton. And if you put them in a corner, even the establishment ones, and said, do you really like this guy? They kind of sputter and say, well, do you want tax cuts and Gorsuch, or do you want Clinton? And we're willing to put up with this. He's just tweeting, he's not serious. I agree with you. I don't think it's great, but that's what's going on. I have faith, maybe it's misplaced, that I sometimes think of it as the Roadrunner Wile E. Coyote test, that right when they get to the cliff, they will step in. But they're really going to have to get to the cliff, and they're not at the cliff yet. That's a very, very intellectual image.
Started the book because of what happened in Charlottesville. And I'd just like you to speak a little bit about how racism and our struggle as a country since forever, continuing until today, what role that has in this discussion about conflict.
Well, the role of race, that's a great question. The role of race in American politics is central and perennial. It has to be because it was our original sin. And I was in Texas. I was in Fort Worth a couple of days ago, and someone said, well, why do we keep beating ourselves up about slavery? I'm like, well, you obviously were never in slavery, or you wouldn't ask that question. He also said, that we're in Dallas, Texas. He said, we've never been more divided. I'm like, well, you know, an American president was murdered about 4 blocks away. That was pretty divided. So there's that. W.E.B. Du Bois, others have always talked about how race is the problem of American history. I think that, you know, the compromise we made in the Constitution was we decided that the assertions of human equality were conditional. And so we institutionalized our hypocrisy. And slowly but surely, because of the work, the incredibly brave witness of a lot of folks who trained here, whether it's Diane Nash and John Lewis and Foreman and Farmer, Rosa Parks, Dr. King, who wrote the Highlander Folk School in Monteagle, they raised their voices. They were willing to shed their blood, sometimes did shed their blood, asking us not for special treatment, but for equal treatment. How can you be for equality? If you say that all are created equal, then you have to act that way. And that, in many ways, the story of American history is the story of our more generous understanding, our more wide-ranging understanding of what that definition means, that the Jeffersonian assertion of equality. And maybe this will make some of you feel slightly better. I don't think Donald Trump would be president if the country were not on what was almost certainly an inexorable trajectory to be more diverse, more tolerant, a more pluralistic place. The ferocity of the reaction itself vindicates the basic truth of the trend. I would bet a lot of money that in 20 years, this will be much more like Barack Obama's America than Donald Trump's. It's going to be hard to get there. It's going to be, and I don't mean that politically. I don't mean that about federal spending and all of that. I don't mean that. What I do mean is that it's going to look different. And in many ways, this presidency, for it or against it, is a kind of desperate stand for a way of life that didn't really exist anyway. But when he said, make America great again, what he was really saying was make America like it was in 1956 again. And if you looked like me, and you were a boringly heterosexual white Southern guy, that was a pretty good time. I wouldn't have minded 1956. You probably would, because you would, you know, people of color certainly would. Women haven't voted for a century yet. It's been 98 years. It's been 50 years since the Voting Rights Act. It's been 3 years next month since the marriage equality decision. People always say, oh, you know, the gay movement, the gay rights, the marriage movement is moving so fast. I have never heard a single homosexual person tell me how fast that movement moves. It's always a heterosexual saying, boy, they're really fast. Obviously, you're not gay and haven't wanted to get married.
John, I think we're supposed to wrap up here in a second. So there's one fascinating passage that I actually texted you when I read it.
There's one?
No. And it's at the occasion of the Freedmen's Memorial to Lincoln on the grounds of the Capitol.
Yeah.
And Frederick Douglass is speaking. And he speaks in there, and he said, you can look at it, but he says something to the effect of, and he's not meaning to, as we'd say today, throw shade at Lincoln, but he was saying basically, you have to remember to my white brothers, you were his children, we were his stepchildren.
Yeah.
And this sense of that, and you even say Lincoln's purpose was to save the Union first and to end slavery second.
Right.
And I think one of the things you've done a nice job of is helping us see history not in light of today's world, but in light of the world they were in the middle of.
Absolutely.
So I'd love for you to, maybe that'd be the last thing that you could talk about is how do we look at this broad sweep of history that we're a part of and realize that this moment is, our perspective is a lot different than it would have been if...
Absolutely. One of the things, I found this with every book I've written, usually several weeks after I've finished and I can't do anything else, I think of something that I should have said, or I think of something that I've said that I shouldn't. A phrase I've come up with since this was published, which I really like and wish I'd thought of it before, is we have to be careful not to fall prey to the narcissism of the present. The idea that our problems are so unique and so insuperable that we are uniquely challenged and uniquely persecuted or uniquely blessed for two reasons. I think it's a problem for two reasons. One is it does a disservice to the past. It minimizes the remarkable achievements, the blood, toil, tears, and sweat that people spent to build a country that we benefit from and that we have to preserve and defend. And the other is if we act as though everything was this kind of warm glow Camelot before, without remembering that Camelot ended badly, I think we foreclose the possibility of learning from it. And the American, this is a great place to stop. The American experiment is essentially, yes, it's about the idea of equality, yes, it's about fair play, but pull it back just a few more yards, and the American Revolution was the military and political manifestation of a really radical idea in the 18th century, which was that reason should have an equal place against passion in the arena. The founding fathers weren't working in isolation. They were working at the end of a 300-year shift in Western life. 1455, Gutenberg publishes the first Bible, his first Bible, movable type, democratizes information. The Protestant Reformations shift the emphasis from the authority of prelates, priests, popes, and kings to individuals who would determine their own path to salvation, their own destinies. The entire world, prior to the scientific revolution, prior to the European Enlightenment, prior to the Scottish Moral Enlightenment, prior to Gutenberg, had been organized vertically. Kings, popes told us all what to do. They were either by an accident of birth or an incident of election given authority over the minds and lives of others. The American Revolution was an attempt to make this a more horizontal vision of life, where we were born, in the words of the Declaration, with the rights, the inalienable rights of life, liberty, and to pursue happiness. Now, it wasn't horizontal for everybody. It wasn't horizontal for slaves. It wasn't horizontal for American Indians. It wasn't horizontal for women. But the story of the country has been trying to fulfill that promise. And one of the greatest phrases in our national life, and one of the great insights, is that we're not seeking a perfect union, but a more perfect one. And we can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good.
That's a good place to stop. Thank you very much. Thank you, sir. Well done.